and we can begin. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Habura Sunday special. Not something we've done before, something we may continue to do in the future, even during membership mode. Welcome to our guests who haven't been here before. The Habura is a virtual and physical Bet Midrash with students from all around the world. Our new membership curriculum begins in July, please God, covering Mikra, Halacha, Talmud, Machshaba, and history. To join our currently over 150 students already signed up, please do visit the website, thehabura.com. Now, moving on to tonight's shiur, the first half of a two-part series dedicated to Baalei Tosafot and Hachmei Sefarad. Now, I was asked, why is it that a series like this matters? And why is it important to host topics, shiurim like this on topics like this? And I wanted to quote the words of our Rosh Bet Midrash in the first edition of our quarterly journal as follows. The perspectives, thoughts, worldview, and customs of the Jews are diverse and wide-ranging. This diversity runs to our very origins. We began as a family, but even the family was born from difference. Yaakov fathered 12 children who became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. Those 12 children came from 4 different mothers, 2 of whom were women not related to Yaakov, as Rachel and Leah were. And while today all that is left of that great and diverse nation are descendants of 3 tribes, the genetics of all are undoubtedly within us. We are anything but monolithic. And yet, in the diversity of our nation, there are members whose light at times has shined brighter than others. In the most recent chapter of our long history, the Ashkenazi branch of the family has found the greatest public face and prominence, while the Sephardi branch, which was the mainstream for 80% of Jewish history, has been largely obscured. Both of these beautiful Mesorot come from a treasury of culture, of thought, and of worldview that is an integral and essential part of the Jewish story. Now, why do we host this at the Habura? Well, a fundamental objective of the Habura is to provide our students around the world with 2 important things: framework and context. This series, like much of our Torah learning, will offer contextual insights into the approach of Hachamim who come from 2 very different schools of thought, but who have ultimately left indelible marks on our Judaism. We plan to take this context with us into the larger framework of Torah education and ultimately enhance our understanding of Torah, which will no doubt impact our practice and our avodah. Next Sunday's shiur will be focused on the Sephardi school of thought. So let us focus tonight on part 1, dedicated to the Baalei Tosafot, the rabbis of Franco-German or Ashkenazi Jewry. During their formative period between 12th and 15th century, the Ashkenazim constituted less than 30% of world Jewry. Nevertheless, their commentaries and approach to Torah has no doubt become beyond influential all these years later. We have a very special Hacham with us here tonight to explore these giants of Ashkenazi Jewry, Rabbi Chaim Rappaport. Rabbi Chaim has served in various roles throughout his career: head of the Leeds Kollel, rabbi for the Birmingham Central Synagogue, head of the Birmingham Rabbinic Board, and rabbi to the Ilford Synagogue. In 2003, he received a master's in Jewish ethics, and in 2005, he was appointed Dean of Machon Mayim Chaim. He has also served as an advisor to the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, alav shalom. Rabbi Rappaport is a widely sought out speaker, educator, and counselor with an encyclopedic knowledge of both classical and contemporary Jewish sources, and always willing to approach and discuss the challenges of modernity. Rabbi Rappaport, I want to thank you on behalf of the Habura for accepting our invitation to share with us tonight. The stage is yours. Bechavod. I will now unmute you, if you're able to unmute yourself, Rav, and I will pin you. So let me know if you can do so here.
Good evening, Morai Rabotai. Thank you very much for a warm introduction. The individual that has made the shidduch, the match between myself and the Habura, is Rabbi Nati Arazi Cohen, who is a member of the Rabbinic Training Academy here in London. And that's where we met up. In the Kollel, we're learning currently the Sugya of Kiddush Hashem, martyrdom in Jewish law and thought. And one of the earliest, actually the first Seif in Shulchan Aruch, in Yoreh De'ah, Siman Kuf Nun Zayin, Seif Aleph, discusses essentially a clash between the Maimonidean and the Tosafist culture. Regarding voluntary martyrdom, we all know that martyrdom, giving up one's life, surrendering one's life for Judaism, is a mitzvah. It's the mitzvah of V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, and it is also in the negative injunction, V'lo t'chalalu et shem kodshi. There are occasions where one is obliged, according to Jewish law, to surrender one's life rather than to commit a transgression. Rambam famously, in his early life, when he wrote the Epistle on Martyrdom or the Epistle on Apostasy, the Igeret Hashmad, ruled that when there is no obligation to give up one's life, it is strictly forbidden to give up one's life, to the extent that if a person does give up his life in situations where it is not mandated, such Mesirut Nefesh is not warranted, it is considered no less than an act of suicide. The Rambam reiterates this ruling twice in the 5th chapter of his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, the Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah. 5th chapter, he says that someone who gives up his life when he's not obliged to do so is held accountable. He's mitchayev b'nafsho. And the ruling of the Rambam is actually reflected in the writings of Nachmanides, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman, although he probably had some more room for maneuver, and similarly other great scholars of the Spanish Andalusian tradition as well. In sharp contrast to this, we find that the Baalei HaTosafot, most prominently one of the first Baalei HaTosafot, Rabbeinu Tam, Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam, actually believed otherwise. In Tosafot, in Avodah Zarah 27b, Dibur HaMatchil Yachol, we have there the view that if a person wishes to give up his life, even when he's not obliged to do so, Horeshut biyado, he has the entitlement. It is his privilege, it is his prerogative, and he may go ahead and do so. This view is most firmly attributed specifically to Rabbeinu Tam, and I see him very much as the prototype for the Baalei HaTosfot in general. In gloss on Avodah Zarah, Yud Ches Amud Aleph, 18a, where he discusses the voluntary act of 400 boys and 400 girls recorded in Gittin 57b on Zion Amud Beis, who, when they were taken captive and they realized that they were going to be used for immoral purposes, they threw themselves overboard into the ocean. And Rabbeinu Tam says that this, he doesn't just treat it as an Agadic narrative, he treats this as a halachic precedent for the idea of people giving up their lives, even in circumstances where they're not obliged to do so. Why is this relevant to the presentation this evening on the Baalei HaTosafot? And one of the earliest Baalei HaTosafot, Rabbeinu Tam, who in a sense left his imprint on all the Baalei HaTosafot, even those who went on to disagree with him, formulate their own schools of thinking. It is important for the following reason. I wish to argue, and I'm not the first one to say so, that Rabbeinu Tam is often seen as a dialectical scholar, someone who reads every Gemara, bearing in mind every other Gemara, confronts contradictions, conflicting implications, and discovers reconciliations, different ways of intertwining and being miyashev stirot, solving blatant contradictions or implied contradictions between different sugyot through differentiating between circumstances, sometimes more obvious differentiations, sometimes more complex, nuanced differentiations. But I personally look at Rabbeinu Tam, and to a large extent the Baalei HaTosafot in general, wearing a completely different hat. What Rabbeinu Tam and the Baalei HaTosafot were often doing in their pilpolistic acrobatics, if you wish to call it that, was they were seeking to bring the halacha in line with reality, or bring reality in line with halacha. That means to say like this: Rabbeinu Tam lived in a European Jewish community in the Middle Ages, which was fraught with its challenges. And there were real situations in which the observance of halacha was near impossible for the Jews of his time. Classical example of this is Rabbeinu Tam's comment in Sanhedrin Samech Gimel Amud Beis, Sanhedrin 63b. There the Gemara says that it is forbidden to engage in a business partnership with a Gentile, because maybe one will come into a dispute, and then he'll have to summon his partner to court, and in court, his non-Jewish partner will make an oath evoking the name of a false god, of a foreign deity. Rabbeinu Tam says that nowadays we do this. We do enter business, and we do even bring them to court. And there is, Rabbeinu Tam says, he doesn't see this to be a violation of the prohibition, V'shem Elohim acherim lo yisaskiru lo yishama al picha. Do not allow the name of another God to be caused to be heard through you. In other words, do not cause a non-Jew to come to court and evoke the name of another God in an oath, in a lawsuit. Why not? Why does our practice? He says, because the Christians, the Gentiles with whom we come into contact, they are meshatev shem shamayim b'davar acher. They mention God, and they also mention the other components of the Trinity, of the Godhead in Christian thought, including the name of Yeshu. Without going into the details of that Tosfos, the idea that Tosfos presents, Rabbeinu Tam presents, and cited in many Rishonim, whilst it appears to be a nuance in the prohibition of Shem Elohim acherim lo yishama al picha, actually what Rabbeinu Tam was doing, he was engaged in saving Ashkenazi Jewry from the reductio ad absurdum of halacha. For were medieval Ashkenaz halacha to have assumed this prohibition as real and as dogmatic, then it would have been impossible for Jews who were anyway constrained and confined in areas which they could do business to make a living. It would render interaction with non-Jewish people impossible, and therefore people would die of poverty. This was an untenable situation. And therefore Rabbeinu Tam had to save the day. Very often, Rabbeinu Tam's comments are found in the Tosfos without giving us the economical or social cultural background. This particular comment in Tosfos and Sanhedrin is very clear. Rabbeinu Tam doesn't make any bones of it. He tells us very clearly what it is. He's concerned about the realistic survival of the Jewish people and the viability of their existence amongst the nations. But there are some times where Tosfos makes a comment, it looks like an innocent comment, or he asks a stira from one place to another, and is miyashev the stira, and it looks as if he's just engaging in internal lomdus, in a internal analysis of the source. But really, there is something much more practical, pragmatic at stake. And it's something to do with the viability of halacha in society. Now, let's go back for a moment to Kiddush Hashem before we pause to analyze a little more. What practical concern did Rabbeinu Tam or the Balei HaTosfos have that led them to justify voluntary martyrdom? At face value, there doesn't really seem to be any solid support for such a view from the Gemara. In fact, Tosfos cites a story from the Yerushalmi in Shavuos and in Sanhedrin. Tosfos there in Avodah Zarah, of Zion and Beis. He cites a story from the Yerushalmi. But the story, the way we have it in the Yerushalmi, and the way all the manuscripts seem to have preserved that story, would yield the opposite conclusion of Tosfos. I'm not going into all the details because I realize I'm pressed for time and I want to, otherwise I would. So what was it in this particular case? I believe it wasn't so much prescriptive, but it was defensive. For we know that Ashkenazi Jewry had a long-standing history, predated Rabbeinu Tam, during Rabbeinu Tam's life, and after Rabbeinu Tam's death, where people not only gave up their lives voluntarily rather than undergo forced conversion, but they even, or other sins for which one is not obliged to give up one's life, and certainly not obliged to take one's own life. People did so throughout a lengthy period of time. Now imagine you have a tradition nowadays where you open the pages of the Gemara and you suddenly look back 200 years of Jewish history. You look at Chachamim and Rabbanim that you respect and admire and hold in high esteem. And you say, their lives have been in contrast to this halakha. They were fake rabbis. All your gedolim suddenly fall off their pedestal of prominence. Is that a tenable position? Of course not. Just as much as Rabbeinu Tam had to tweak the halacha of shutafut, partnership with a goy, to fit the circumstances in Christian medieval France, Germany, so too did Rabbeinu Tam need to find precedent within halacha to justify the past, the illustrious past, people who the community considered to be saints, martyrs, people who they composed kinot, lamentations and dirges, eulogies, which are some of them which are recited till today on Tisha B'Av. to have these people condemned posthumously was unthinkable. And therefore the Baalei HaTosfos would want to find every possible justification to sanctify their practice and to justify them. So some of the works of the Tosafists were done with the eye in the past and some with the eye in the future. Before I go into become more discursive, I want to give you a very interesting example from the din of Kefiyat Gitin, imposing on a husband, a recalcitrant husband, the obligation to give a get. That means that a Beth Din would take a husband who was reluctant to give his wife a get and literally force him by sheer brutal force, to compel him, to coerce him, to cajole him to give a get. Based on the Gemara in Ksubis, based off Samachem and Aleph, the way it was read by all his predecessors, including his grandfather Rashi. There is a din that if a woman says, Ma'is alai, this man is repugnant to me, I cannot live with him, it's unbearable, then there are circumstances, of course, with all the requisite caveats, according to which the Sugya dictates that the Beis Din is entitled to compel the husband, even using physical force, to give a get. Rabbeinu Tam, and again, I don't have time to go into the detail of his interpretation, but in his interpretation of the Sugya there in Maseches Ksubis, he turns the whole thing on its head. With a sleight of the hand, he gives a new interpretation to a few words in the Sugya, a novel translation of a phrase in the Talmud, and suddenly the Talmud completely opposes such coercion. A student in yeshiva who's learning Maseches Ksubis, is learning the tractate, may not understand at all what was at stake here. You might think this is just a question of what's the pshat in the Gemara. But if we look in the Teshuvot of Rabbeinu Tam as they appear published in the Sefer HaYashar, we see very clearly that Rabbeinu Tam was on a jihad here. This was no abstract hypothetical issue. There was a Beis Din, which included esteemed rabbis, including a certain Rabbeinu Meshulam, with whom Rabbeinu Tam locked horns on other occasions, who had actually implemented such kafiyah, such coercion. A Beis Din of 3 rabbis, all of them recognized in the world, in the broader world of the Baalei HaTosafot. And Rabbeinu Tam undid their ruling. He wrote to them in no uncertain terms that he was not impressed and that he was completely mevatel, nullified their ruling. Now, there are times when Rabbeinu Tam suggests that sometimes maybe he protests too much, that I thought of this pshat before any ma'aseh came to me. I was convinced that this is the meaning of the Gemara, even in the absence of any practical challenge. But in this particular case, it seems clear that Rabbeinu Tam himself was aware of what was at stake. There was something that he didn't want to happen. He did not want kafiyat gitin. Why didn't he want kafiyat gitin? That's a matter for scholars to speculate. I've seen that some academic scholars suggest, Abraham Grossman, that Rabbeinu Tam was living in the thick of Catholic Europe. In Catholic Europe, the idea of polygamy was out of the question. Divorce was also not an option. That is why the Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, the ban on having two wives, became ever more intense and solidified during that period of the Balei HaTosafot. That is also why some scholars have suggested Rabbeinu Tam was against kafiyat gitin. It was almost as if the whole notion of a get in and of itself stuck out like a sore thumb, was too Jewishly conspicuous, that to not have kafiyat gitin, to have coerced gitin, would be pushing the envelope too far in the Christian Gentile environment. But I want to suggest actually a different pragmatic reason that Rabbeinu Tam had, which is alluded to in the words of his tshuva. Some may say Rabbeinu Tam was a little bit insensitive to the plight of a woman who's going to remain an aguna. But what Rabbeinu Tam says in one place, I would rather have a situation that a woman would remain chained without the ability to extricate herself from an impossible marriage, than have a situation whereby people would cast aspersions on the children that she would give birth to in a future marriage as being mamzerim. Rabbeinu Tam saw both the wood and the trees. Immediate empathy, knee-jerk compassion would have it that we should embrace the Talmudic precedent of kafiyat gitin. For the sake of freeing women from the straits and constraints of a bad marriage. But looking further down the road, Rabbeinu Tam thought to himself, but if this woman is going to get married again, and the notion of kafiyat gitin would not be viewed on by the populace as a real get, what you're going to have is a situation, she's going to get married again, give birth to children who won't be let into Jewish schools or won't be allowed to get married, or they will have a certain stigma attached to them as being pseudo-mamzerim, because the community wouldn't recognize the legitimacy of her forced get. Now, it's difficult for us to get into the mindset and also to get a vivid picture of the culture and the way that people work. But there is no question that there is evidence in the Middle Ages of just such type of aspersions being cast. So whether Rabbeinu Tam was right or wrong, his consideration was a pragmatic one. The interpretation of Rabbeinu Tam that appears on the pages of the Gemara looks like a typical dialectic in the Sugya. But the consideration that Rabbeinu Tam had in mind was a pragmatic one. he was speaking not only as a scholar in an ivory tower, but as a pragmatic leader of the community, someone with foresight on the needs of the community. There are so many more examples. I've given one off the beaten track, which I don't think many people have heard of. We could talk about the case of Rabbeinu Tam allowing people to give interest, usury to non-Jews and take usury from non-Jews, which is a subject of a dispute in the Talmud. There are many other cases. But what I would like to do now in my presentation is to turn for a moment about something which has bothered me, does bother me, and probably will always bother me, about this dialectic. So what we have here is like this. In the rabbinic decision-making process, rabbis look at precedents and texts. We try and decipher the meaning of the law based on the reading of the text. What's the connotation of the words? What does the phrase mean? But rabbis also have agendas, halachic agendas, religious agendas, theological agendas. To say that rabbis look at every question with equanimity and they have no bias in favor of one ruling or another, I don't think I need to convince members of the Chabura that that is not correct. Of course, there were many considerations in favor of one view or another. But where I have personally struggled with is on precisely how this balance works between textual reading, connotation of the canonized law, and the so-called meta-halachic considerations that a halachic authority will bear in mind. If we are to say that the text is just plasticine and you can twist it to fit in anything you want to say, that's to make a mockery of Jewish law. It's to ridicule Torah Sheba'al Peh. It is to scoff the whole tradition of any rabbinic decision-making process, be it the Sephardi, Ashkenazi, medieval, or modern approach. If, on the other hand, we say, no, actually, the rabbis were only governed by text, and Yikov Adin Tahar, they didn't care about the reality, the empirical reality which they confronted had no sway over their decisions, over their rulings, and that is to also an injustice to the rabbis and a certain blindness to historical fact. So I've often said to my Talmidim, it's like this. A text can lend itself to more than one plausible interpretation. There are, of course, implausible interpretations. But plausible interpretations, sometimes a text can be read one way or another. So a rabbi who has a particular desideratum, a particular goal, a particular theological or pragmatic point that he wants to push, has a certain latitude when it comes to the interpretation of the text, because he can choose to interpret it in one of two ways. This doesn't mean to say, as one thinker put it, as one publicist put it, where there is rabbinic will, there is halachic way. No, there are confines, there are limitations, there are boundaries, there are parameters. But within those parameters, there is an area of latitude. Text can be read one way, it can be read another way. It is within that framework that the rabbi's inclination will find expression. But even this synthesis is an oversimplification. And it seems sometimes that the rabbis in the Middle Ages had a lot more power, autonomy, when it came to this interplay between textual reading and pragmatic ruling. I'm going to mention to you a Tosfos, also a ruling of Rabbeinu Tam, which has nothing to do with the social, cultural function of the community. There's a Gemara in Shabbos, everyone knows this Gemara in Daf Kuf Yutes, that a person is obliged to eat 3 su'udot on Shabbat. The Gemara connects it with the 3 words in the Pasuk in Exodus chapter 16, Ichluhu hayom, ki Shabbat hayom la Hashem, hayom lo timtzu'u basadeh. Hayom, hayom, hayom. 3 times. So Rabbeinu Tam, cited there in the comments, the Balei HaTosafot says, when it says 3 sudot, it doesn't really need to be 3 sudot. The 3rd sudah, you can just have some fruit, or you can be yotzei with something very minimal. Strange Tosafot, why would Rabbeinu Tam say so? No one else says so. Rambam doesn't say so. When we read the Sefer HaYashar, which is Rabbeinu Tam's response, so we find that Rabbeinu Tam was inspired by something quite magical, as certain parts of Ashkenazi Jewry were inclined to do. He speaks there about a midrashic tradition, some obscure midrashic tradition, to the effect that if a person drinks water in the period of twilight, ben hashemashot, then he's gozelet krovav hamitim. He is stealing his dead relatives. In a highly anthropomorphic vision of the fate of the dead, the deceased relatives are about to return to the fires of purgatory after nightfall. They're given a brief respite during which they could have a cold glass of water, perhaps even a freezing shower in the river. But if you drink the water from the river, then you're taking this water and depriving the dead relatives. There's a shortage of water supply. Now, during the week, this wasn't a major problem because people ate their evening meal long before twilight. But on Shabbat afternoon, when they would wait till nightfall, some people would have the Su'udah Shlishit towards the evening. And then Rabbeinu Tam was concerned that if they would eat then, they would drink then. If they would drink then, they would violate this midrashic challenge problem. And in the Sefer HaYashar, it says that Rabbeinu Tam got very angry. Ka'as or Rabbeinu Meshulam. He was angry with Rabbeinu Meshulam and made a feast then, made a su'udah. Now, if you study the works of Israel Tashma, for example, Chachmei Ashkenaz Kadmon, or even some of Grossman's works, you will come across an enormous amount of magical, astrological, demonological orientated customs. Many of them have survived. Many of them are only kept by a few elite today, and many of them have faded altogether into oblivion. But Ashkenaz, medieval Ashkenaz, was to a large extent dominated, in the best sense of the word, with spirits. So whilst Rabbeinu Tam, as he is found in the commentaries on Shabbat 119, seems to be making an innocent remark, projecting a view that Sudah Shlishit doesn't need to be a full meal with bread. Once again, the Talmudic commentary that looks so innocuous really represents a completely different agenda. Ashkenazi preoccupation with, shall we say, the world of the spirits. All of this transcends my rational mind. And so there's nothing wrong in learning the Tosafot and looking just at what they're dealing with in terms of the words and the glosses and the Gisaot, versions and manuscripts, but it's only half the picture. Now, coming back a little bit to this tension between text and authority. We all know what Maimonides, the Rambam, writes in his introduction to the Mishneh Torah. And in a similar vein that I have this expressed by Rabbi Yosef Karo in his Kesef Mishneh in the second chapter of the Rules of Rebels, L'chot Mamrim, the Chatimat Talmud, the notion that after the Mishnah is sacrosanct and no one can argue, and after the Talmud is sacrosanct and the Gemara remains the final court of appeal for Jewish law, is something that happened because of Kabbalat Klal Yisrael. There was no heavenly voice that came down and said, from now on you can't argue. It was a certain consensus that emerged from within the Jewish people. The Jewish people accepted the Talmud. After all, why should it be that way? Why could not the Rabbanan Savurai or the Gaonim or even the Rishonim argue with the Talmud? But this was something that came from within. If you wish, a collective communal acceptance. Now, I remember giving a class to students on the subject of it. When you learn Gemara, very often the Gemara asks a question on a Mishnah, various questions, several questions, and then the Gemara says, Chasrei michasra v'achei ketane. The Mishnah is deficient. There's a lacuna in the text. There is something missing, and the Mishnah must be read slightly differently. And this is how it should be read. And the Mishnah becomes 3 times as long. And the entire meaning of the Mishnah is changed. Or sometimes you have a ruling in the Mishnah, which seems to be giving a blanket ruling in a statement, And the Gemara asks a question. The Gemara says the Mishnah is talking about one very specific case, almost the exception to the rule. And I remember even going to school finding this very strange. Why did the Mishnah not say what it meant? Why did the Gemara need to uncover entire lines which were absent from the Mishnah? And then I read the introduction of Rabbeinu Menachem HaMeiri, a scholar indeed from the Provence, south of France, in the 13th century, but with strong Maimonidean leanings. And the Meiri says there that when it says that the Mishnah is made, the Gemara makes a narrow ukimta to say that the Mishnah is only referring to one very specific case. He says this was done when the rabbis wanted to disagree with their predecessors, but rather than coming out in direct confrontation with the text, dismissing. This is written in the Meiri writes this, someone just asked, the Meiri writes this in his Hakdama, his introduction to Masechet Avot, to Tractate Avot, when he discusses the Seder HaKabbalah, the order of the tradition, dating back to Sinai throughout the generations. So he goes through the different Kufot, the Mishnah and the Gemara. And he says, so rather than scrap the canon, so to speak, they reread the canon. And then he adds the following words. I hope I'm paraphrasing correctly, because I'm speaking from memory. As we sometimes do to our predecessors and our elders. With the knowledge that they are superior to us, but all this, he says, comes to show she'ein shleimut b'vnei adam, that there is no perfection in mankind, even amongst the most elite. You have to see these few lines of the Meiri, because it's extremely illuminating. Now, it is of course not the only pshat in Chasurim and Chasra, and there are other interpretations and other ways of understanding it. But this is the view of the Meiri. Why is this relevant to what we've been speaking about tonight? Because if we see that the rabbis of the Talmud did this sometimes with the Mishnah, even though they accepted the concept of Khatimat HaMishnah and the canonization of the Mishnah. Is it possible that this was sometimes done by later rabbis after the Khatimat Talmud? This is just a question. I don't know. Now a word on the future. In light of all the above, I think it's extremely understandable why the dialectics of the Balei HaTosfos are so significant in the 21st century as we grapple with the realities of our own history, changes and the challenges of our times, and the need to apply halachic norms. The Balei HaTosfos sometimes used arguments, textual explanations, but they also used other concepts, principles such as Mishum Eiva, as animosity, as a Kavod HaBriot. There's a Tosfot in Moed Katan, very strange Tosfot. Tosfot discusses the practices of Avilut, of mourning, which include covering the head, Atifat Avel, full covering of the head, Apichat Mitot, turning over the beds. Tosfot say, we don't do this because it would cause ridicule. No textual appeal, just authoritative dogma on behalf of the Balei HaTosfos to say, we don't have the same freedom of thought or freedom of hand, freedom of interpretation as the Goinim and the Rishonim in their day did. It seems that as time goes on, the bottleneck becomes tighter. But for those of us who sometimes feel that if we want to be really from holier than thou, we must completely dispel any pragmatism and remain focused only on the theoretics of halacha. The legacy of the Balei HaTosfot teaches us all that this is not how halacha works. It may be difficult to get the balance right, but the aim has got to be the combination of pragmatic and theoretical considerations, intertwine and interplay with the interpretation of text and precedent to create a healthy equilibrium, one which is both loyal to the giver of the law and to the people of the book. Thank you.
Hacham, thank you so much. I mean, it's so inspiring to see how our Hachamim of all the generations were so in tune with reality. You call it pragmatism. Definitely, that's the term I'd use as well. But with this commitment to Berit, but a commitment to the developing world, and trying to maintain Yiddishkeit, if you like, for lack of a better term, in any given situation, of course, with boundary and with limitation. So it's a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Rav. I know there are questions. I'm having people messaging me, chatting me, saying how fantastic this was. We are going to have to get you back, Rav, whether you like it or not, because it was much needed wisdom. Does anybody want to unmute? I know, Ohad, you had a question. Do you want to unmute and go ahead and ask the Rav?
Sure. Thank you, Rav. That was a beautiful presentation. I think there's a little slight difference, maybe I might be wrong, but with what the Meiri is writing, that the Ukimta and the Achsule Mersera of the Talmud was, it feels like when they disagreed over a pre-existing tradition. meaning there was a tradition that they had, and then it just couldn't fit in with the Mishnah. What Tosfot is seemingly doing is with an innovation, meaning to respond to a reality, and then they're reinterpreting the text for the issue that arose, versus a set tradition or something like that.
I hear what you say, and it may be the case. It may also be not the case, because the Meiri says that it's very similar to what we do when we disagree with our predecessors. He gives specifically an analogy. So, and he speaks about the fact being she'ein shlemut b'bnei adam. So I think the Meiri is probably directly talking about a case where there is actually a theoretical reason to differ rather than a practical reason to differ. However, what I was wondering, and I was only posing this as a question, this Meiri speaks volumes, because once again, one may ask, does the Meiri mean to say, how far does this go? This ploy of Chasura Mechasra, which is trying, as the Meiri says, to maintain the sanctity of the canon, but in order to do so, is not really being intellectually honest. It's an extremely daring situation that the Meiri makes, and I would even be frightened to attribute this to anyone else, or or say that others, that the Balei HaTosfos ever used this principle in their thinking. I wish to emphasize that. I was just saying that in terms of a precedent for the need for rabbis who had the full respect for their background and tradition to assert their autonomy is something that we are familiar with from the past. And in that sense, and in that sense only, I wanted to cite the Meiri. But I saw that someone just asked something. The comments of the Meiri, I know that I wasn't very textual tonight. In other words, I avoided spending long times in presenting texts because I wanted to cram in as much as possible. B'li neder, I will send the text of the Meiri along, and then you will be able to have it. Just 1 second, I'll see if I can, yeah. I'll send it along afterwards.
Thank you, Rav. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks, Art, for the question. I know Rav Phillips has a question. Rav Phillips, you want to unmute? Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So I noticed many of the examples of the Tosfos that we're bringing tend to be Rabbeinu Tam. And I've noticed this also when I've been learning that Rabbeinu Tam always seems to be a little bit of an outlier when it comes to putting together the opinion on a sugya. So how many of the things you're saying would you say is typical of all the Tosfos, and how many might be for the particular approach for Rabbeinu Tam?
Well, Rabbeinu Tam and Rabbeinu Yitzchak are the two main Balei Tosfos. The Rabbeinu Tam and the Ri, I would say that a large portion of the Tosfos, it's difficult to know exactly how much, but are really them. In addition to them, you have others, but many of the others were influenced by them. So yes, there are differences between Rabbeinu Tam, and he even had disputes with Rabbeinu Meshulam. He had disputes with Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor, who was a disciple of his, but was quite independent-minded. But I do think that in general terms, the agenda of Rabbeinu Tam as a pragmatic halachist is something that was very much in the consciousness of the entire school of the Balei HaTosfos.
Thank you, Rav. And thank you, Rav, for the question.
I mean, I find myself very often when I'm looking at modern questions, for example, if we discuss the question of Nashim B'Talmud Torah, women learning Torah. So, I don't want to go into the subject now, but if you read the Rambam in Hilchot Talmud Torah 113, you can read it. There are two ways of reading that very same text. We often find situations where a text tolerates, where the words can be legitimately, without being contrived, legitimately interpreted in one of two ways. And I often find myself thinking, I know what I think the text should read, or what I want the text to read. But why do I want the text to read one thing rather than the other? Is this because I watched a program on BBC? It could be, but not necessarily. It could be because when we speak about Torah, we're not just talking about halakha. Torah has halakha, but it also has meta-halachic principles. For example, Rabbeinu Tam was very concerned about HaTorah chassa al mamanam shel Yisrael. The Torah is concerned about the Jewish economic state, the economy of Jewish people. That's a value. So in Rabbeinu Tam's discussion about what it means, noten tam lefgam, how long a pot has got to wait before it's considered to be noisen tam lefgam in Hilchos Isav Het and Yeridea, the concept of hefsed, the concept of potential loss of money or of food, plays a role in his considerations. It's clear, he says so in his discussion with Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor. We should be lenient because of hefsed. Now, there's just been a machlokes about discussing whether Nosen Tam Lefgam requires 24 hours wait or requires only Linat Laila, the passage of a night, which depends on how you translate words in the Gemara. And then suddenly Rabbeinu Tam is saying, but maybe there's room to be lenient because of financial, economic concerns. My reading is that for Rabbeinu Tam, as for myself, not comparing myself in stature, but for any posek, the awareness of the economic concerns is not a detraction from one's shleimut, one's halachic status. On the contrary, that is a Torah consideration. It may not be a halachic consideration per se, but it's a Torah consideration. Torah is not just halacha. Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote a tshuva about whether it would be possible to appoint a convert, a ger, as a Rosh Yeshiva. And he says, starts the tshuva by saying ostensibly no, because the Rambam in Hilchot Malachim 1:5 says you can't appoint a ger in a position of Sirara, and ostensibly the position of Rosh Yeshiva is a position of Sirara. However, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, he goes on, but we are obliged to do everything we can to ameliorate the plight of converts. We see that the spirit of the Torah is to extend ourselves towards converts, to facilitate. Therefore, let us see if we can find another way of reading the situation. And he carries on his tshuva to say, well, one could argue that the position of Rosh Yeshiva, although it entails Sirara, but the intrinsic position is not one of Sirara, it's a position of teaching, which has an ancillary element of Sarah, letting in Talmidim or expelling Talmidim. So we see the poskim do this the whole time. Would you say that he was engaging here in like non-pure? No. Because if you could interpret Sarah in one of two ways, and you can make such a dialectical distinction between two types of Sarah, and both of them are plausible readings of the text, at least they are according to Rabbi Feinstein, then must illuminate we deal with the text. Anyway, I've perhaps gone on a little bit too long in the response.
Not at all, Rav. I think we just lost you for a little bit. The connection got a bit lost there. Can you still hear us, Rav?
I can hear you.
You can still hear us? Okay, fantastic. I think a couple of more questions. One here, Dov has asked, I don't know if it's so much a specific question, as much as that in general, the Tosafot method will probably be defined by his trying to fit variant Gemarot together to a far greater degree to what had been done before then. Focusing on the few cases where the motivations are from super Talmudic sources or societal reasons seems to be...
losing you now. I'm losing you.
You're losing?
On a few cases.
Shall I post it into the chat so you can read it? Focusing
if you can, yes, please.
On the few, yeah, I'll post it there. It might be a little bit easier to read for everybody. I think it's a very interesting point. There we go. This might need a share in of itself.
It's a very valid point, actually,
yeah.
And enables me to explain. I wasn't suggesting for a moment that Rabbeinu Tam's entire career was one of dealing with the challenges of pragmatism. There are plenty discussions where Rabbeinu Tam is busy reconciling Gemaras, which have no pragmatic difference whatsoever, and gets into the same type of minutiae. For example, Rabbeinu Tam in Bava Basra 16b confronts their Gemara, which says that there was a stone on Avraham Avinu's chest, which anyone who was ill would come and look at it and would be healed. And the Bali Atosfos asked a question, how does this fit in with the Gemara in Bava Metzia, Pedal Damad Beis, where it says, or Pezayin Damad Beis, I can't remember now, where it says that until Yaakov Avinu there was no illness. So how would there be any ill people to see the Margalit that was hanging in Avraham Avinu's chest? And there's a teretz of Rabbeinu Tam, and there's a teretz of Ri, and if you look in the various works of the Bali Atosfot, there's a lot of discussion about this contradiction. And the distinctions that are made are between different types of illness, natural illness, illness through being struck, through a makah, an injury, and all sorts of sophistic dialectics. I would agree with the questioner now that this Tosfot, I mean, just one that just came to mind, and I'm sorry, that's the one that came to mind if it didn't do the trick, had nothing to do with any social, cultural, financial concerns in medieval Christendom or Paris or France or whatever it was. And there are hundreds of discussions like that. Perhaps I should have said that I was talking about the interplay specifically between Rabbeinu Tam as a parshan and Rabbeinu Tam as a posek, and as a leader, as a manhig. The Shia for 1 hour could have taken various forms and shapes. I could have discussed, perhaps you would have liked me to have discussed the different ways of how Rabbeinu Tam, for example, Rambam dealt with contradictions, and Rabbeinu Tam did. We could have gone into a whole discussion. Rambam would have been much more ready to say that there are different approaches in the Talmud, rather than try and reconcile, or to choose the Yerushalmi over the Bavli, or whatever it may be. The whole idea of reconciliation in Maimonides. Had I chosen to give a lecture on that element of Rabbeinu Tam or the Balei HaTosfos in their career, then you may have heard nothing about the pragmatics. It would be a very narrow and restrictive approach to some, and ridiculous to suggest that all Rabbeinu Tam was busy was with the type of challenges that I was discussing.
Thank you, Rav. And we've just secured the next topic of the next year that you'll be giving us, please, at the Chabura, because that sounds.
But that's a very fascinating subject. Parshanut Talmud. Yeah,
absolutely.
And one way to, that's actually the Meiri is a very good way. The Meiri often mentions both approaches, and sometimes very helpful in exposing you to that. I guess.
For a lot of us.
Will we come to an end now?
Yes, we have. I think there's one final question, Rav, if you have a couple of minutes, if you don't mind. One final one by Avi Garson. Avi, go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you, Rav.
Oh, only if you have time, Rabbi. But I just wanted to focus a little bit on the beliefs, or you could say something like the spirits that you mentioned, those notions that you said that the Tosafists were sometimes they mention. We think of sort of in medieval Ashkenaz of the ghettos, or they were very segregated. So where did that osmosis take place? Because it didn't have precedent in sort of the halachic writings before that. So where did that influence come from, and how, if they were so sort of, segregated from the Christian, I'm talking about the Chachamim specifically and the rabbis, where did that interaction come from? And I've heard different theories, but I'd like to hear what the rabbi thinks. And thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of discussion about that, about where Rabbeinu Tam may have been exposed, or where the Balei HaTosfos in general. You know, someone just mentioned, the Rambam's influence of Aristotelian thinking. But there was also, there's no question that the Rishonim were exposed to different ways, different dialectics that were taking place in other schools of law. They weren't as ostracized as one likes to think. They had Gentile connections. They had cross-denominational connections, meetings. And they were certainly, clever people, and they had access to other literature. Osmosis is an interesting word which you use, because in the tightest and most secluded of areas we see even today, there is still room for osmosis. No one is free from the circulation of ideas. Sometimes it's through over the garden fence, the Gentile neighbor, but there are hundreds of ways of how it happens, different ideas coming into no one is in an island. And there was definitely a lot of interaction with non-Jews. We see it on the level of business. Tosfos and Avodah Zarah, numerous occasions, speaks about the interaction with Gentiles, about wine, about selling candles for the church. There was merchandise. People were living in the real world, and no one was in totally cocooned in his own bubble. On that note, I'll
thank you so much, Rav. Thank you. Thank you for staying on for so long, and we look forward to welcoming you back at the Chabura again. Everybody, see you next week for part 2 with Rabbi Aaron Haleva. Thank you very much again, Rav. And what a perfect coincidence that it's on the Arayat, the yard site of the Rebbe, I know
Take
your
care.
time is already. So thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Yes, so much honored to be able to give words.
Indeed. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you.
Laila Tov.